Houthi attacks may have rerouted 60% of ships around the Cape of Good Hope, disrupting global trade in the process, but the threat posed by missiles and uncrewed surface vessels actually sits at the lower end of the risk spectrum for shipping. Things could be worse. A lot worse, actually. That was the rather worrying assessment this week from the latest in a series of geopolitical risk webinars that we've been running here at Lloyd's List. This edition with insights from our friends over at Jane's Defence. And we talked, yes, about the Red and Black Sea risks, but more generally, we were looking at the risks that should be higher up the shipping industry's agenda right now. And there are many such threats on the horizon. For all their haphazard half-truths and fictional claims, the Houthis have managed to prove just how exposed maritime trade is right now to even the most basic attacks on chokepoints. For all its lauded adaptability, seaborne trade is actually highly vulnerable, and bad actors don't really need high level of sophistication to cause widespread disruption. They don't even need a huge amount of successful attacks. The mere threat is sufficient, in some cases, to divert globalization, as we've seen. Today, it's the Bab el-Mandeb. Tomorrow, what about the Taiwan Strait? And what about the less visible threats to shipping security? It's not just Joe Biden who's worried about Chinese spy cranes right now. China's evolving relationships with the US and Russia requires a risk assessment, certainly, but the increasingly blurred lines between Chinese commercial and state-controlled entities and across the shipping and logistics space, well, that's being flagged as a major concern by companies, particularly in relation to the data access and intelligence-gathering abilities it affords the Chinese state. Anyway, we'll get to that, but let's start with the physical security risks. And to my point at the start, and I know you don't want to hear this, but things don't necessarily get better from here. The Houthis may have disrupted trade lanes, but the ability of a bad actor to close a maritime choke point with mines, well, that's a much more dangerous scenario than the one we're dealing with right now.
I mean, we think about Bab el-Mandeb, we think about Straits of Hormuz, Straits of Malacca, but all around the world, Suez, Panama, Straits of Dover. You start mining the Straits of Dover, then that's catastrophic. The Great Belt going into the Baltic. A concerted attempt to close, particularly through mining, would stretch the naval capacity to deal with it beyond breaking point. Mine countermeasures is not something that we do. Well, we do it very well, but we don't have a great capacity to do it. And it's already stretched further than it should be now.
That was Mike Plunkett, Senior Naval Platforms Analyst at Jane's, and he was talking about the ability of navies to protect shipping. And, spoiler alert, he doesn't think things are going to get any better anytime soon. But we will come to that in a moment, because I want to bring in here our resident security and data specialist, Bridget Dyken, who starts us off with a very handy scene setter of the current security situation as seen through the lens of Lloyd's List intelligence data.
Right now we've got two very active conflicts that have direct impacts on maritime trade. So in both cases of the Black Sea and Red Sea, the situation is dynamic, and we're having to constantly revisit and reassess the situation. So it's not unreasonable to assume that the situation in the Black Sea has settled given how long the war has been going on, but we see changes both relating to Ukraine and Russian trade. So vessels going to Ukraine are often disregarding the advice to sail closer to the coastlines of Bulgaria and Romania to reach Ukraine's Black Sea ports. And we also have ships traveling through the Kerch Strait that are disabling their AIS to do so. And the ship-to-ship transfer area located in the south of the Kerch Strait has actually been completely vacated, with ships engaging in these transfers further south. All of this relating to the conflict and to Russia trying to protect its assets and its infrastructure. On the screen there, I have an example of GPS jamming. So the GPS jamming really picked up at the end of the year, and it continues to be a very big problem. It's complicating efforts for sanctions, compliance, due diligence checks, because really it's a third-party actor that's kind of interfering with the AIS data, and it's making it difficult to track the ships. So you can see here the ship showing up in Sevastopol, Crimea, also up in Moscow as well. And then we also see the presence of drones, which is starting to impact maritime traffic. So because of this, we're getting a lot of ships sailing along the coastline of Turkey before heading up to the ports of Novorossiysk, as well as the ports in and around the Kerch Strait. You actually see live happening when attacks are anticipated, vessels stopping en route or starting to drift and rerouting as well to avoid that threat. In the Red Sea, the risk assessment is a moving target. So the Houthis are regularly revisiting their target profile and revising it. We're on the 4th iteration of it now. And they're also deploying new weapons, strategies, and threatening and attempting attacks outside of their traditional zone of aggression. So we've seen this graph before, but transits through the Bab el-Mandeb are down about 60% on normal pre-attack levels. And while we saw the transit stabilize for about a 12-week period, we're seeing the numbers starting to fall a bit. It's not clear if this is the start of a new downward trend or if it's a blip in the data. But so far, we're not seeing the same exodus that we saw in December and January, where the situation was clearly deteriorating rapidly. The rumors that claim that Russian and Chinese vessels get a free pass when passing through the Bab el-Mandeb are disproven not only by the Houthis, who clearly target ships that have Russian and Chinese interests, but the most recent data shows that the number of Russian affiliated ships passing through there hasn't changed, while the number of Chinese affiliated vessels have gone down about half at this point. There's also an assumption that most vessels are choosing to disable the AIS while passing through the Bab el-Mandeb for safety reasons. This is also not true. There was a spike in dark transits in December and January, and that was the period of heightened uncertainty, but the number has since dropped significantly and is more in line with the volumes that we see last year. So it is a higher percentage of total transits, but this makes sense because of such a high fall in vessel traffic. So it still only represents about 7% compared to 3% overall.
So that's where we are right now. And of course, we know that the Houthi hits are evolving and getting more dangerous and more deadly. The recent deployment of sea drones in particular has increased that threat level for shipping, as evidenced by the recent sinking of the Kamsarmax bulker Tutor. Interesting aside here, while the average age of ships passing through the Bab el-Mandeb has increased from 13 years old in 2023 to nearly 17 years old this year, the Tutor was an expensive anomaly that has really focused minds on the increasing asset prices of ships that are passing through the danger zone. Tutor was only delivered in 2022 at a cost of $27.2 million, and as the broker's BRS pointed out this week, the asset replacement cost of that vessel via a 5-year-old unit with a standard spec would cost an additional $10 million on that original price. Anyway, back to Mike Plunkett here from James, because as a formal naval man himself, he offers a very useful view of that relationship between the navies and commercial shipping, which isn't as close as perhaps it could be.
Navies tend to try and stay away from merchant shipping as much as possible. They tend to get in the way. And as a result, it's only that you see the sort of thing like Prosperity Guardian gets stood up very much on an ad hoc basis. So navies come along as and when they are needed. And there is no real standing plan for what happens when somebody like the Houthis or the Chinese or the Russians decide to close or interfere with one of the major choke points in the world. Depending on the threat that you find yourself faced with, the ease with which it can be dealt is variable. So I would suggest that the current threat that we have, or that we are seeing posed by the Houthis, with some fairly random missile and drone attacks, is towards the easier end of the scale. That all you need, in inverted commas, is some warships in the area capable of shooting stuff down. And to be fair, they have been remarkably effective at that. In fact, we've had warships demonstrating capabilities that hadn't previously been assigned to them. For example, HMS Diamond shooting down a ballistic missile. 6 months ago, if you'd asked the Royal Navy, does HMS Diamond have an anti-ballistic missile capability, they said no, it doesn't. Well, it turns out she does. And that may have surprised them as well. If you go to the other end of the sort of difficulty scale, and it's worth noting that the Houthis have never actually really tried to close the Bab el-Mandeb. They are interfering with traffic, but they're not stopping it. If they wanted to close it completely, and this goes for pretty much any choke point in the world, you mine it. You put mines in. Or you don't even have to put mines in. You threaten to put mines in. And that will force a very long, complicated, expensive and slow process to either clear what you have sown in the affected area, or to prove that you haven't sown anything. And as we all know, you can't prove a negative. So even after the mine clearing operations concluded, nobody could ever be really sure that there's nothing there. So yeah, as I said, the Houthis have been fairly random in their application of attacks against shipping. But even that sort of random approach, as Bridget's data has shown, has had a massive effect on the actual traffic that is being that is in the area, and the response that has had to be made to it to try and reassure the world's merchant shipping.
All of which, of course, is interesting. But what does that mean for shipping? Can navies actually protect shipping? That's the question.
If you look at what has happened since the Houthis started this back in October last year, they've launched hundreds, if not thousands, of individual attacks. And out of that, I think they've hit about 30 ships. So they're not having a particularly high success rate, which, if you are of a gambling persuasion, might lead you to believe that your chances of making it through the Red Sea are probably pretty good. I don't think the naval response will ever get to the point where they will be able to guarantee that you won't be hit or you won't be attacked. But I think they're probably, with the two operations that are currently stood up there, I think you're probably at the point where they can say, this is as good as it's going to get. We will do our very best to protect you. And we've seen the multiple engagements that have happened over the last 9 months or so that they have done. They've been true to their word and have done their level best to intercept any missiles or drones heading towards merchant ships. I think what will be interesting is, now that the US carrier has left, the Eisenhower departed late last week, I think, and will not be relieved for another week at least, whether that has any effect on the number or intensity of the Houthi attacks. But I think we're probably at a stalemate point now, and all that you can really hope for to sort of guarantee safe passage is for the Houthis to put their hands up and say, all right, we're done.
Okay, let's take a step back from the missiles and the drones for a minute and consider some of the less visible threats. Because China featured pretty heavily on the list of potential geopolitical risk factors for shipping during our discussion this week. According to Nisa Felton, who's the Senior Manager of Geoeconomic Influence and Threat Intelligence at Janes, the increasingly blurred lines between Chinese commercial and state-controlled entities is being flagged as a pretty major concern by companies, particularly in relation to the data access and intelligence-gathering abilities that it affords Chinese state. She argues that Chinese companies now have access to a pretty broad range of proprietary data about maritime ownership and cargo and trade routes and resupply requirements, personnel, the list goes on. And the point is that that could all be pretty useful in terms of defense intelligence purposes. The repercussions of that could give China greater visibility into a country's logistics systems and be used strategically to target economic coercion efforts, she argued. But Nisa also raised concerns regarding China's systematic investment in key maritime infrastructure and the shifting nature of China's trading relationship in the wake of Western sanctions.
From the perspective of a China watcher, one of the kind of key issues that will become increasingly focused upon in the next months is the U.S. election. We've seen some consistency in U.S.-China policy from the Trump to the Biden administration, but there is the potential for consistency, but also further change. There has been quite a bit of spillover effects to Chinese trade investments and supply routes in response to export controls, sanctions, et cetera, imposed by the US, EU, and others. We've seen this supply chains moving, Chinese and other countries' supply chains moving, not just from China, within China, like a China plus one, essentially manufacturing China for sale in China, and then also moving those supply chains to places like Southeast Asia. But we've also seen increased activity, for example, in South America as China has used free trade agreements kind of in a consolidated manner, signing free trade agreements with nearly all Latin American countries with the Pacific coastline, as they are also building out infrastructure to support that and reduce dependence on the Panama Canal. But also the China-Russia relationship is one that we've been following closely as well. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we've seen China take advantage of the vacuum left by Western companies in Russia. We've seen an increase in cross-border logistics between the two countries. We've seen new Arctic activities taking place along the Northern Sea Route. And we've also seen combined activities in Central Asia and the Caucasus, as that's a region of shared interest for those two countries. So there's a lot of moving pieces. And so these are kind of some of the key issues that we're looking at as we look into the next few months.
China and its dominant beneficial ownership links across the maritime value chain also came up when we embarked on the inevitable discussion about sanctions risk. Here's podcast regular and principal analyst at Lloyd's List Intelligence, Michelle Vesey-Bachmann.
2 points to make here. Firstly, China has been the biggest beneficiary of Western sanctions because it takes deeply discounted sanctioned oil, which accounts for, depending at any one time, about a fifth to a quarter of its imports, seaborne imports. But the second point is that the dark fleet was really born from China, the second iteration at least, when OFAC first reimposed sanctions back on Iran I think it's about 5 years ago now. So you had COSCO, the Chinese government state-owned ship owner, got sanctioned, its tanker arm got sanctioned by US regulators for breaching these extraterritorial sanctions on Iran. And that's when you first saw elderly tonnage, instead of being shipped on old COSCO tonnage, these tankers that were sanctioned, it moved to this anonymous model. And so that was sort of established for Iran, worked nicely for Venezuela, went on steroids for Russia. Given that China is an integral part of the dark fleet, a lot of the ISM managers, which are usually single ship SPV companies, are based in Hong Kong or China. If we were to dig deep and be able to dive into the British Virgin Islands and all these tax havens where these ships are nominally meant to be owned, I think we would find Chinese ownership behind some of them, because you have to look at who these oil flows are benefiting.
That is significant when you are dealing with a trading system that is now increasingly divided down national lines, where you can and can't trade. And we talk about sanctions risk in terms of legal focus. These are economic instruments, after all, and we are seeing an evolution of that right now. But there is also the unintended consequences of these sanctions that mean a good 14% of the tanker fleet is currently trading inside the dark fleet. And crucially, that means it is trading outside of the established rules-based order of mainstream insurance, class, and safety standards.
Absolutely, and I've long maintained that the dark fleet is an accident waiting to happen. I've spoken to some of the crews, that the crews are mistreated, the condition on board these vessels, they're poorly maintained, they're with flag states that don't have any technical expertise or any willingness to tackle some of those issues. Some vessels don't even call it a port, they're used solely for ship-to-ship transfers because the logistics infrastructure is so convoluted. A cargo leaving Iran, for example, will be transferred to 3 or 4 different ships before it arrives at its ultimate destination, usually China or Syria. So some vessels don't even get to some port state control inspections, and others, they call it Russia, they discharge at India or China, and the areas where you would expect shipping to provide those safety nets aren't being implemented. And, I'm looking at some reports at the moment of terrible technical deficiencies on these vessels when they're inspected, and they keep on sailing. And there are many in the industry that are extremely concerned about, there being an accident very, very soon.
Okay, now there was a lot more in the webinar, which, despite coming with a few frustrating audio issues in the live broadcast, for which I am deeply sorry as you tuned in, and I promise the next one will be perfect, it is still worth a listen. But I'm going to end with the traditional question that I ask at the end of most interviews, And that is, what's keeping you awake at night? Here's Bridget's response.
I am worried about things becoming more widespread. So we've got, the main ones, Black Sea, Red Sea, obviously other conflicts. I'm worried about something kicking off more Asia way and having resources of navies essentially being stretched a bit too thin to deal with multiple crises at one time.
And here's Michelle's response.
Abandoned seafarers. Each one of those 430 ships has 22 to 25 seafarers on. I've already received emails and details about some of the horrific conditions under which they're living and the horrific conditions of the ships in which they have no choice but to be on. And we're already looking at record numbers this year of abandoned seafarers when these vessels no longer serve any useful purpose. No, neither will the seafarers. So that keeps me awake at night, to be honest.
And to close out the podcast, and I'm probably going to give you all some sleepless nights here, here's Mike.
To echo what Bridget said to an extent, a concerted campaign to not just disrupt choke points, but to close them. I mean, we think about Bab el-Mandeb, we think about Straits of Hormuz, Straits of Malacca, but all around the world, Suez, Panama, Strait of Dover. You start mining the Straits of Dover, then that's catastrophic. The Great Belt going into the Baltic. A concerted attempt to close, particularly through mining, would stretch the naval capacity to deal with it beyond breaking point. Mine countermeasures is not something that we do. Well, we do it very well, but we don't have a great capacity to do it. And it's already stretched further than it should be now.
Okay. Well, that's where we're going to leave this week's edition. As I say, please do go back and listen to the whole thing. We will be back next week with more insights to keep you awake at night. But in the meantime, stay safe out there. Goodbye.